So I want to turn it over to Jonathan Beaver, who's going to say a few words about IAEP, and then I'll introduce our speakers for today.
Thanks, Marion, and thanks for everybody for being here. I'm really excited for this in part because I'm really excited about the future of the collaboration between ISEE and IAEP. I am one of the two co-directors with David Utzler of IAEP, National Association of Environmental Philosophy. Again, I'm really excited for this, and I just might take a moment to say the three presenters have been doing really great work for our organizations for several years, and I'm excited about their research and the broad ways they're thinking about the ethics of attention. So again, I'm really grateful for them for doing this work and for Marion for co-hosting with IAEP.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, we're really excited to be doing this collaborative event, and I want to thank actually Julian, Justin, and Nora for kind of bringing us together and facilitating, sparking this collaboration. So I want to introduce each of our speakers, and then we'll dive in. So we're going to start with a presentation by Nora Ward and Justin Simpson that will focus on a forthcoming book called An Environmental Ethic of Surprise on the Virtue of Playful, Loving Attention. And I want to just tell you a little bit about each of those speakers. And then I think I'll also introduce Julian now so that we can kind of move seamlessly between the presentations. So Nora Ward is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Galway in Ireland. Her research focus is in environmental philosophy with special interests in deep ecology, environmental justice, post-humanism, philosophy of conservation, and the ethics of attention. Justin Simpson is a philosophy lecturer at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. His research cross-pollinates post-humanisms and indigenous philosophies with environmental ethics and social epistemology. He is currently investigating the relation between Western conceptions of death and biotemporal diversity, song and flower within Aztec philosophy and academic trauma. And then the next speaker is going to be Julian Evans, who's an instructor who teaches political ecology and political theory at University of Victoria in Canada. His research focuses on the ecological dimensions of perception and imagination with a special interest in listening, sound, and animal-human relations. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Nora and Justin.
Hi, everybody, and thank you. And thank you very much also just again to Marion and for Jonathan for facilitating this collaboration. And hopefully it will inspire further conversation and collaboration. And I'm just going to share my screen. So yeah, we're just going to start off, as Marion said. Justin and I will talk for about 25 minutes. And the first part will detail just some of the connections we see between attention and environmental ethics. And then the second half will give a little bit of a deeper glimpse into our argument, albeit briefly. There will be, as you can probably tell, a bit of a bird theme that's going to probably carry on also into Julian's talk. So, and like Marion said, this is going to be based on the research project we're currently involved in. So the book Environmental Ethic of Surprise on the Virtue of Playful and Loving Attention. Okay, so during the pandemic-related lockdowns, the conservation organization Birdwatch Ireland observed something unusual, an increase in the reported sightings of rare and exotic birds. What soon became apparent, though, was that most of these sightings were not rare or exotic. The colorful birds with dusty blue caps, red underbellies, and flashy black and white wings were just chaffinches, a common Irish garden bird. It wasn't then that these were scarce or unusual birds, rather it was that people were paying attention for the first time to previously overlooked non-humans that they shared places with. This increased attentiveness to birds and other wildlife, which has been documented now in other areas, also correlated in the case of birds with an increase in bird feeding, as attested by the significant increase in sales in bird feed products, among other bird-related products. This example, we think, reveals the ways in which attention can intersect with ethics, in that watching the birds effectively motivated attempts to care for the birds. And so such an anecdote inspires broader questions about the ethical significance and normative potential of paying attention to non-humans within environmental ethics. Why is attention environmentally, ethically, existentially meaningful? And given the connection between attention and action that we see here, what does it mean to pay attention well?
So to begin, we would like to motivate this webinar by detailing some of the ways in which attention and ethics are entangled. For one, the different things we pay attention to impacts one's quality of life, what it means to flourish, and one's likelihood of living a good ethical life. Paying attention to non-humans enriches the texture of reality, making it thicker, denser, and more intricate. The world becomes more interesting and surprising, not only when we see something for the first time, but when we linger and regularly attend. Due to the interdependency of the world, paying attention to one thing often leads to noticing another thing, and then another thing. The birds in Ireland, or at least them being noticed, is consequently not necessarily a simple, finite addition to the landscape. The birds themselves and the rest of the world were being noticed in an infinite number of new ways. Making a similar point, Anthony Weston writes, quote, "Climbing in the hills or walking in rolling country, you learn quickly to watch for unusual circling or gathering over the next hill. The birds tell us things that we wouldn't otherwise know. Something has died, something threatens, something happens over there," end quote. That is, paying attention to birds opens a world of relations, not only to the bird itself, but through the bird to other things and happenings over there. With each new node and relationship noticed, there are new ways to feel, think, and act, as well as new ways of becoming and being. In this regard, paying attention holds the promise of healing self-inflicted nihilistic wounds in the West. Paying attention to non-humans as well as humans often reveals that there's more than meets the eye, as the other defies expectation. The Earth can go from a previous barren wasteland of dead, inert, passive objects to being saturated with the meaning that non-human subjects imbue it. As the bird feed sails attest, we can get wrapped up in these dynamic, more than human worlds. Paying attention thus might help address the growing sense of species loneliness or even cosmic loneliness. That is, paying attention reveals that non-humans are not alone. This is not merely because there are other things that are active, creative, and surprising like us, but also because there's a multiplicity of surprising and creative agencies that are unlike us, with their own lives going on, which invest the world with meaning. To quote Weston again, paying attention reveals, quote, "an animate presence beyond human that broadens and deepens the human world," end quote. Following Baptiste Morisot, the hope is that an account of paying attention well will lead to a more lovable cosmology. Moreover, within this more diverse world of meaningful existence and relations, a person is better positioned to understand the meaning of their own lives, to develop self-awareness. Paying attention reveals the other, which in turn allows one to reflect on the consequences of one's actions. This not only allows one to become more ethically responsible or accountable, but also, if we think that a body is defined by its effects on others with Spinoza, then these consequences are constitutive of who we are. Beyond possible sites of reflection on identity, non-humans can also help us understand the meaning of becoming and living. As Morisot contends, quote, "the mystery that their form of life constitutes reminds me of the mystery of mine. To exist as a living human being remains in my eyes an enigma, but this enigma is clearer, richer, and more livable in contact with other living beings, those enigmas," end quote.
We do not want to reduce, though, the ethical value of paying attention to an instrumentality or simply a tool to understand the world and ourselves better. Paying attention then can be a way to honor the obligation we have to non-humans. According to Robin Wall Kimmerer, each person has a responsibility to reciprocate the earth in return for the gifts that we received from nature. Kimmerer contends that, quote, "paying attention is a form of reciprocity with the living world, receiving the gifts with open eyes and open hearts. At the very least, paying attention reciprocates the world as an expression of gratitude. Despite one being able to do many things, one has chosen to use their time and energy to pay attention to another. Such a choice reflects that one cares about the other. They regard them highly, or ultimately they are choice worthy. In fact, paying attention might be considered the bare minimum in terms of fulfilling one's ethical obligations. Kimmerer again writes that, quote, "the earth is so richly endowed that the least we can do in return is to pay attention," end quote. The hope then is that in such initial attention plants the seeds that can lead to more profound changes. Each time we look and look again or continue to attend in other ways holds the opportunity that something new might pull at one's heartstrings and minds. Moreover, it holds the opportunity that new heartstrings and new, more responsible ways of thinking, feeling, and acting might emerge. In this regard, then, paying attention can also be political. It can establish the boundaries of the moral community, making it a true cosmopolitics or a democracy of species. Each moment of attention is a potential opening. It is a dilation that allows us to be touched by the other and to recognize the other's subjective standing. They are not simply over there as an indifferent and inert object, but possess the presence of a subject who calls upon us to feel, think, and act in relation to them. As an ethical obligation, then, paying attention is not a tedious chore. Indeed, it can be a rewarding experience in and of itself. There are moments of surprise, laughter, fun, and impassioned curiosity. It can be great simply to be in the presence of others and possibly to be attended to in return. For instance, Marzo explains that, quote, when you come across a wild animal by chance in the forest, you have the impression of a gift, and, quote, the animal before you did not have to appear and might just have easily taken a different path or remain hidden. It did not, nor does not, have to continue to exist or as an individual or as a species, but it somehow manages to. Despite all this contingency, it is nevertheless here now, and its presence as a gift in its own right that can elicit powerful effects such as joy. Marza writes that how he felt joy at their beauty, strangeness, diversity, and respectability. Making a similar point, Kimmerer notes that despite the ongoing environmental destruction, even a wounded earth can, quote, give us moments of wonder and joy, end quote. It is simply a matter of paying attention.
Given the ethical importance of paying attention, it's not sufficient to leave the point here like a school teacher saying, pay attention. There are many ways to pay attention, and not all of them are equally good, and none of them are ever innocent. For instance, last year there was an influx of North American birds in the western coastlines of Europe because they were blown off course due to storms while attempting to migrate south. This influx created great excitement in birdwatching circles in Ireland and the UK, but also sparked debates about the etiquette and culture of birding groups. Issues were noted about large groups of birdwatchers crowding the already stressed, hungry, and lost birds. Along with the concerns about the welfare of the birds, these critiques touch on a more general perception of birding as a hobby, which at times can be driven by a compulsion for numbers and rarity, striving to see the most rare birds as possible. A tendency which was also represented starkly and humorously in the movie The Big Year. As Frere McGregor notes in the Audubon, birding can, quote, often feel subtly or overtly competitive, end quote. The birds themselves can become a means to winning or being the best. In this way, the birds are seen but also not seen. Even within the sciences, it's complicated. Despite traditional scientific practice attempting to objectively attend to their subject of study, the ideal of objectivity can obscure or create the non-human more than reveal them. As Vincent Desprez contends, historically, in the disciplines that use empirical observation to study non-humans, there has been a tendency to make their test subject, quote, submit to the theories that guide research, to submit to the problem that is imposed on them, to the manner in which the researcher constructs and defines it, end quote. Moreover, Desprez reveals how what we attend to or notice is shaped by how we attend to the other, which itself is shaped by the context. Drawing from primatologist Thelma Rowell's work on Isha'asha baboons, Desprez problematizes the common view that animal societies are hierarchical by nature, noting how these observations were often the product of the observational context. For example, Rowell noticed that all previous studies were conducted by randomly pairing monkeys together and putting them in competition for a limited amount of food or space. It was not necessarily that the baboons themselves then were competitive. As Rowell points out, quote, hierarchy only appears so well and so stable within conditions where researchers have actively provoked and maintained them, end quote. Rowell's work on Isha'asha baboons being non-hierarchical, however, was dismissed as an exception to the rule, or in some cases as a product of bad scientific practice. This raises questions about who was actually paying attention to the other versus projecting or distorting. Put differently, what exactly does it mean to pay attention well?
So given this general motivation, we would like to now offer a brief glimpse or window into the main argument of our project and book. So in general, we argue that playful and loving attention is an environmental virtue. The argument is premised on an environmental ethics of surprise that challenges the various views of non-humans as passive, inert, lacking, and predictable within the history of much Western philosophy. Bringing together empirical examples such as crayfish eating wolves, talking parrots, musical orcas, maze-solving slime moles, with theoretical research by Brian Massamy, Emmanuel Cochia, Karen Barad, Tim Ingold, and Dupre, we contend that non-humans are surprising, playful, creative, joyful, relational, and becoming singularities. More specifically, non-humans are unique and active, creatively acting and constructing their own worlds. Non-humans can become, over time, through their iterative interactions with others, undergoing and precipitating substantial change in the world. Insofar as becoming is always a little creative, non-humans also have this ability to do the unexpected and overflow these past or human-imposed categories. Consequently, as Dupre writes, no one knows ahead of time what they are capable of. Given this surprising nature, one must consequently pay attention to non-humans to understand them. While Simone Weil, Iris Murdoch, and William James provide helpful normative accounts of attention, we ultimately find some limitations due to the scientific or moral realism, individualism, or undergirding their accounts, or how attention can be reduced to sight or selfless observation in cognitive models. So to supplement these accounts, we propose a more corporeal attention that involves achieving a bodily attunement between improvising bodies in motion. In the words of Arne Ness, quote, the joyful experiencing of nature is partially dependent upon conscious or unconscious development of a sensitivity for qualities, end quote. This account goes beyond paying attention to individual non-humans exclusively, such as the bird outside one's window, to paying attention also to the relationships between oneself, the other, and the environment. By starting with this more embodied perspective, we hope to not only reveal the animacies of non-humans, but also the effective dimensions of environmental work.
Considering non-humans as intersubjective beings that engage in world-building projects, we draw on Maria Lugones to think of attention as a form of world traveling, in which one attempts to take the perspective of the other. Following Lugones, paying attention well in a loving way requires traveling to non-human worlds with a playful attitude. Given the differences between humans and non-humans, such as lacking a shared language and cultural norms, we turn to Brian Massamy and Elizabeth Beneke to expand Lugones' notion of world traveling to include non-humans. We compare playful world traveling to Massumy's description of sympathy as an effect and situational form of consciousness. Traveling to non-human worlds is not merely speculative or a matter of spectating, but involves immersing oneself in the dynamic field of the effective forces associated with the other's world. Within the thralls of the situation, one is exposed to not only the categorical effects of what the other is, but also the vitality effects of the other as a singular, enthusiastic body that moves from the given in the direction of the new. We contend that loving attention as a form of good, playful world traveling amounts to balancing the categorical and vitality effects of non-humans. To further articulate Masumy's account and ultimately playful world travel, we then turn to Beneke's account of improvised dance as a physical dialogue. Unlike how site-based models localize discrete bodies, improvised dance involves an interkinesthetic and multisensory awareness that is directed both at oneself and the other, such that one can ultimately touch, hold, support, and resist the other during the dance in the right way. Improvised dance also requires a peripheral vision associated with being aware of the larger field of supports, such as the dance floor and gravity. To dance well, they must dance together as a we, which represents a multi-membered system with its own center of gravity and momentum. Each experiences and moves in relation to the other, as well as in relation to the immanent and contingent dance form. Such a dance form is not given, but a product of each creatively initiating new moves in response to the other partner's previous moves in the overall history of the dance up to that point. It is ultimately the dance form that leads each participant. Accordingly, they must remain effectively immersed in the worldly dance form to let it lead them, to stay on top of its moving crest and ultimately to keep up with this dynamic situation and stay attuned to the other as a moving, experiencing, and responsive body. Consequently, unlike a choreographed dance, in this case, each dancer's identity and horizon of action is not known in advance, but emerges over time in relation to the dance form in the other. Yet each dancer never loses their singularity or agency, since keeping the dance alive depends on each initiating their own new moves. We contend that improvised dance offers a good model of playful, loving attention because of its open-ended, other-oriented responsiveness. As an expression of love, such attentiveness responds to who the other is. Yet the other is not regarded as having a fixed essence. While the other is recognized qua other in terms of their previous history of actions, character dispositions, interests, style of movement, aesthetics, and physical characteristics, they are not reducible to these properties. Who and what the other is always potentially in the process of overspilling and initiating new surprising moves. Furthermore, improvised dance presents an account of loving attention insofar as the relationship, the dance form, is the product of both of them. Each dance partner not only gets a say, but their expressions are taken up by the other in this physical dialogue. The dance form is an expression of both of them. More precisely, the dance is not simply a combination or superposition of them as individuals acting in isolation, but an expression of a we that develops through the dance. Finally, each move seeks to simultaneously affirm the creative and surprising nature of each. With each turn, a dancer can initiate a new move based on their creative and aesthetic sensibility. However, to keep the dance going, such a move must also maintain or enrich the field of support so that the other dancer always has the chance to creatively express themselves next.
Okay, we're nearly there. So given the pretty abstract or metaphorical nature of the account so far, we also consider a possible real-life example of attentive world traveling through the work and experiences of nature writer Ellen Malloy. In Eating Stone, her book, Malloy documents a year spent following a band of bighorn sheep in the Southwest desert. Her time was, like the dance form as depicted above, immersive, improvisational, and corporeal. She spent hours sitting on rocks, looking through binoculars, listening to ravens, guessing the location of the sheep, finding them, and then losing them again. She slept on mesas, beside riverside grazing spots at the foot of steep canyon walls, where the sheep would clamber up and down. This process, as she described, was one of being taught to pay attention. It was not just a matter of simply human will, nor forceful self-abnegation. It involved responding in a multi-sensorial manner to the attentive actions of others. This learning was thus a learning from and a learning with, an approach of understanding how to be a guest in the unpredictable worlds of others, or in her own words, an amicable neighbor. Like then in the case of, say, improvisational dance, this implies a willingness to rescind control and pushing against a historical tendency in which humans made all the moves. Malloy let the sheep lead, cultivating what she calls an unfamiliar patience, end quote, and a sideways glance or sideways knowing that would create a space for the sheep themselves to exert themselves agentially. So in Beneke's words, each with Malloy, when witnesses embracing a quote, genuine attitude of not knowing what is going to happen next, end quote. Over time, Malloy was transformed by her travels, such that a transmutation ensured. And here we can just point to this quote stating, they no longer kept me out of their world. With motions I had come to know as an exquisite union of liturgy and physics, they closed the distance between us and herded me towards a threshold, a place best described as a hair's breadth. So it was not simply about watching sheep over there. There was a kind of entanglement, a reconstitution of identity. As she became part sheep and started to feel, think, attend, and act differently. Following Lagonas, this speaks to the transformative potential of immersing oneself responsively in the worlds of others and consequently seeing yourself from the perspective of that world and allowing the other's perspective to reshape oneself. At the same time, though, this was not an eradication of all difference either. As Malloy confirms, quote, my job is to be human, to bring home the startling news of another existence gravely threatened by human action. It is worth noting, too, that I actually only physically touched the sheep once, so thus paying attention as this improvised dance model does not need to be hands-on or involve years in a desert. It can be more metaphorical. Moreover, although we position Malloy as a kind of virtuous role model, we strive to divorce virtue from its ableist, elitist, and individualist connotations. So to do this, we call, again, for a democratization of attention. Everybody has the ability to pay attention to nature in different ways. And so we need everybody to better understand non-humans. And similarly, attending to nature is not simply an individual affair, but can also require an intergenerational attention.
Finally, we also don't want to paint too rosy of a picture. There is indeed joyful and life-affirming qualities associated with witnessing those previously unnoticed others. However, these are also troubled times, and it's necessary to stay with the trouble with Haraway. In the final part of our work, we look at attending not only to presence, but also absence and loss of non-humans, which are enacted by technology, such as modern homes and cars. We pursue attention as a way of being, quote, affected by the cry of the absent and mute ones, in quote, in Stinger's words. Regarding cars, we consider what it means to attend well to the 2 billion instances of roadkill in the US each year. Such an example returns the book to larger questions about how technology and the built environment mediate attention, as well as raising issues about when human and non-human worlds collide. The act of closely attending to a dead animal might appear redundant or meaningless. At that point, they are already dead. As a gesture, though, it can challenge habitual modes of selective and harmful inattention. Indeed, the general reaction to roadkill is often to ignore it because the speed at which one is traveling, to look away, or worse yet, to play games like roadkill bingo. To offer a more productive and transformational attention to absence and death, we engage the work of Dr. Amanda Stronza, who creates roadkill art through creating beautiful memorials for the dead animals she finds. Such acts transform a so-called absence into a presence that leads one to pause and effectively stay with the trouble. Such a perspective shift creates the possibility of a slippage or a bubbling up of new ways of thinking, feeling, conversing, and living. By attending to and celebrating the life of a non-human in both its tragedy and beauty, we create space for the animals to continue to affect us, even in death. As James Stansico writes, quote, "We've come to be haunted by those we mourn. The beings whose lives are gone still continue with us when we mourn them. Their reality continues to impose itself on our reality. Their existence continues on in our existence. Those we mourn may have left, but they have not left us," end quote. Thank y'all.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the territory of the Lekwungen peoples, as represented today by the Wasanic, Sankes, and Esquimalt nations. I presented a draft version of this article at the ISEE conference in Colorado in 2023. And so thank you to everyone who gave me feedback. It was a very generous and great group of people who gave me some very good substantive comments on this work. And I have since expanded it into this article, which is under review in the journal Environmental Humanities, and is also the final chapter of my dissertation. So there will be some listening exercises, some kind of short soundscape compositions that I'm going to play. So if you have headphones, you could grab them or just, as best you can do. So I'll start my screen share now and make sure the sound is on. Okay. So the title is Deep Listening and the Ethics of Attention. So basically, the kind of overview here is that I argue in the paper that listening enlarges ecological sensibility. And so it's through deep and relational ways of listening that attention to the meaning of non-human animal communication broadens and expands sonic awareness of place. And I look at two kind of case studies or examples in environmental philosophy, the first being Aldo Leopold, and the second, a more recent philosopher, Baptiste Morisot. And I use both of their work to kind of demonstrate how listening can weave together both an embodied encounter of the present and a taking up of the deep past or evolutionary scales of change. And then I argue that it's in this way that listening becomes ethical and political when we understand that the ecological crisis we face today is a crisis of sensibility. So I'm going to start my timer so I don't go over time. So attention is the condition of ethical deliberation. This is a kind of a grounding for my argument. This was kind of, I think, expressed very well through many parts of the first presentation. And so what I'm kind of trying to bring to this discussion or to this discourse in environmental philosophy is that listening has a, sorry, just 1 second here. The Zoom is, I realized I did not start my slideshow. Okay, there we go. The Zoom is in the way and I'm just trying to move it around. There we go. Okay, so what I'm trying to bring to this discussion is to argue that listening has a kind of special role to play in kind of rejuvenating this environmental ethics of attention. So I begin by talking about deep listening. What is deep listening? I use this term to refer to this practice, which intends to heighten and expand consciousness of sound in as many dimensions of awareness as humanly possible. And that is a quote from the visionary composer and early pioneer of electronic music, Pauline Oliveros. So Oliveros is championed in the worlds of avant-garde music, but I believe that she deserves to be read as a deeply ecological philosopher of the listening relationship. For Oliveros, listening is not only possible through, for Oliveros, deep listening is only possible through consciousness, understood for her as acting with awareness, presence, and memory. The deep of deep listening, Oliveros writes, has to do with complexity and boundaries, edges beyond the ordinary and habitual ways of understanding, learning to expand the perception of sounds to include the whole space-time continuum of sound. And that's from her book, Deep Listening, a Composer's Sound Practice, that's here on the right. So deep listening is always concerned with these edges of one's field of awareness and how attention to those edges can create an expansion. So deep listening for Oliveros was both a force for personal, spiritual, but also especially social change. She had an acute awareness of non-human animals as the original deep listeners. Oliveros wrote that birds and insects were listening to humans with complete and total attention because the presence of human beings brings the possibility of life and death. Listening can be the difference between life and death. She writes, listening is survival. So while deep listening is a set of practices and techniques that can be honed by an individual, the exercises and training that Oliveros outlines in her books are largely collective and group experiments. Deep listening shifts continuously from a personal project of attentive perception to a social practice of expanding understanding of the needs, desires, and expressions of others. So I'm going to play a short composition of one of my favorite Oliveros pieces, combined with some recordings I made quite close to my house here in Victoria. All right, so the second kind of framework I take up in this article is that of relational listening, which comes to me from the sound artist and philosopher of listening, Lawrence English, who I was lucky enough to participate in a workshop with last fall on radical listening. And his work is very concerned with understanding the creative role of field recording, kind of contributing to the sonic arts. But I think it's a really a vital and helpful framework for understanding why listening has a special role to play in the environmental ethics of attention. So English suggests that the creativity of the listening subject emerges from attention to an expression of the relationship between these two auditory horizons, that of the organic human ear, so everything we can hear through our sense of hearing, right? And that of the microphone or recording device. And so for English, it is through attention to the differences between these two horizons that he argues perception becomes political. So this the relational form of listening I investigate in my article, I think, helps us to explore the connection between two other auditory horizons, that of the human listening subject and the non-human animal. So it is my claim that as the listening subject works to be more attentive to the ways animals themselves listen, or are more broadly sensitive to their surrounding worlds, this deepens and strengthens the bond between human and animal. This means, for example, listening to a common songbird alarm can alert the careful listeners, say, to the presence of an invisible predator, but it can also lie in a deep history of the evolutionary past. In order to truly listen to the splendor and significance of animal voices, I argue that we must listen with one ear to this deep time scale of evolutionary change, and with the other ear towards the immediate affective dimension of sounds in the present. So listening in this way, I argue throughout this article, when practiced, cultivated, and developed, expands and heightens what I call ecological sensibility. So sensibility here speaks to the embodied experience that involve the powerful immediate presence of non-human animals. And sensibility is often conceived as the capacity to perceive and feel through the senses. However, in philosophy, sensibility has been often taken to be opposed to scientific understanding or conceptual thinking. And I don't think that we need to oppose sensibility to rational knowledge, but instead we can see sensibility nourished by and grounded in knowledge from empirical ecological sciences, ethnology, the study of animal behavior, natural history, and evolutionary biology. Ecological sensibility, therefore, helps us to see how embodied and lived experience can be deepened through relational knowledge of the more than human world. Sensibility is conditioned by the bodily experience of touching, smelling, tasting, seeing, hearing, all of those animal modes of perception which depend upon our skin, noses, tongues, mouth, eyes, and ears. These modes of attention are not narrowed through reasoning and empirical study, but nurtured by them. And so the way of listening I am describing then does not seek to narrow the field of embodied sensory perception, but is a means through which all of the senses can be heightened and opened upon the world. So I draw in the article to understand how listening can kind of become a political and moral act. I engage with this wonderful book by the biologist David Haskell, Sounds Wild and Broken, where he suggests that listening has a very special role to play in coming to terms with the contemporary ecological crisis. The world we are leaving future generations is an impoverished sensory world. Wild sounds are disappearing due to the escalating loss of biodiversity, resulting in a diminished sonic vitality of the earth. In this estrangement, we witness as well the destruction of what Haskell calls the sensory foundation of human ethics. And he writes, when the most powerful species on earth ceases to listen to the voices of others, calamity ensues. The vitality of the world depends in part on whether we turn our ears back to the living earth. To listen in this way is not only an aesthetic experience, but a political and moral act. And so this kind of challenge from Haskell, or this assertion that listening is a political and moral act, was kind of an invitation for me to try and understand or to bridge the understanding of environmental attention and this capacity for moral and political action. So I think the major contribution of Haskell's work is to investigate this kind of ancient and ancestral depth of the experience of listening to non-human communicative sounds. So he notes in this book the paradoxical character of sound itself, being both ephemeral and generative. Sound is passing phenomena, but sound is also what links living beings together in the present moment across great distances. Human beings are interested, awakened by communicative sound in particular, in fascinating ways. And the repetition and rhythm of these ephemeral sounds accounts for their generative power, acting over hundreds of millions of years to produce the astonishingly distinct acoustic character of each singular place on Earth. It is through attentive listening to the singular character of places, with one ear to the deep past and the other to the present moment, that human beings might reverse course. So in terms of attention as the ground of ethics, this section of my paper, I draw on this work by Panizza. I deleted that slide, which helps us to recognize how listening is connected to moral and political acts through this role in the work of attention. Attention defined as that most basic effort to kind of disregard for a moment the concern for the self and acknowledge another's existence. So as Panizza writes, the experience of reality that attention reveals contains with it both a motivation and a form of direction or orientation. So attention often takes time, attention requires patience, attention involves the kind of mental presence arrived through experiences of waiting, meditation, and reflection. And in terms of the philosophical history of the ethics of intention, I have been most inspired by Iris Murdoch, who argues that attention is a virtue in the sense in which I think Murdoch seizes very interestingly on something when she explores how attention has this capacity to confront and address narcissism. It confronts the projection of the self onto reality. And in this article, I argue that we could see that we can extend that to the way in which the human self is projected onto non-human reality. So Murdoch writes that the idea of attention or looking is determinative of one's capacity to make any kind of decision. Quote, I can only choose within the world I can see, in the moral sense of see, which implies that clear vision is the result of moral imagination and moral effort. Freedom, then, for Murdoch is not the emptiness of the moment of choice, but the continuous everyday work of attention, which imperceptibly builds up structures of value all around us. So attention then for Murdoch is an ever unfinished task, which goes on all the time at apparently empty and everyday moments where we are looking. Those peering efforts of imagination, which have such important cumulative results. What I think this philosophical history of the ethics of attention has neglected, though, is the experience of listening in terms of a really thorough account, right? So what gives listening its particular force seems to be the way it enables perceiving at far distances in multiple directions, the way focused and attentive listening brings awareness to the limits or edges of the perceptual field, echoing Oliveros. So the omnidirectional nature of listening, in that we listen to what is behind, what is beside, what is above, what is below us, as opposed to envision we're always directed towards what is in front of our gaze. So in the sonic field, there are always aspects which are perceived through the ears, but hidden from the eyes. And this is, as many philosophers have noted, the acousmatic dimension of sound, right? What is hidden from our vision, but we can hear, right? So basically, this leads me to suggest that listening always takes place at a distance, and yet through listening, a kind of closeness or intimacy between subjects also emerges. Next, in the article, I go into Aldo Leopold's kind of close or careful reading of the section Marshland Elegy from a San Conley Almanac. And I argue that his attentive listening to the sounds of cranes returning to his cherished Wisconsin marsh enables him to connect these two different senses of time, right? The first is this kind of phenological orientation, right? This intimate knowledge of seasonal change. Cyclical, periodic character of life and place, migrations, flowering plants, breeding, leaves changing colors. This is the wisdom of the almanac. But the second sense of time at work here is that of the evolutionary scale of deep time. For Leopold, each year, the clangor of the cranes marks an awakening of spring, where these birds come to the marsh and stand upon their sodden pages of their own history. The layers of peat which make up the bog, described by Leopold as layering the basin of an ancient lake, are compressed remains of mosses, tamaracks, and cranes, which have decomposed since the last glacial retreat. And on this endless caravan of generations, builds with its bones a bridge into the future, so that the cranes which Leopold observes in the present moment live, breed, and die upon the habitat of their ancestors. Leopold asserts that the ability to perceive nature begins with beauty, but expands to values yet uncaptured by language, and the true quality of the cranes lies beyond the reach of worlds. So I argue then that Leopold calls us to dwell not only in the majesty of these sounds, but to interrogate the relationship of the cranes to their lands, their history, to see how these sounds have filled these places for millennia, for eons, and how their startling behavior emerges from the creative power of evolutionary time. And in a recent project, Stan Temple and Christopher Bockhast, two acoustic ecologists from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, have used the extensively detailed field notes of Leopold to imaginatively recreate the soundscapes around Leopold's legendary Wisconsin shack, and condense this into a 5-minute listening experience. So I'm going to play just a short excerpt of that, which I have kind of remixed into some of my own field recordings of trumpeter swans from around a farmhouse that I lived a few years ago. So Temple and Bockhast say that one of Leopold's great insights was to understand that a good sense of land health comes through listening deeply to the soundscapes of place. So the next section of my paper takes up French animal tracker and philosopher Baptiste Morisot, who argues that other ways of being alive. And I'm drawing mostly from his book on the right there, Ways of Being Alive. He has also published this book, Wild Diplomacy, which I was not aware of when I started writing this paper, but I've begun to read now, which is quite fascinating. I think really supports the work I'm trying to do here. So this encounter with other ways of being alive always involves this kind of enigma or mystery that an alien form of embodiment takes. And so this otherness of the non-human animal is never commensurable with human experience, and yet it is still valuable to attempt again and again in a kind of existential way, strategies through which one can kind of sense affinities and kinship. And I believe Morizot's major contribution to environmental philosophy is this argument that that the ecological crisis we face is a crisis of sensibility. And therefore, I argue here that we are in need of modes of attention which rejuvenate and awaken new forms of sensibility towards the wider ecology of which humans are only one part. So Morizot takes up, I argue that Morizot kind of takes up the form of listening I am arguing for in this paper through this encounter with wolf howls and songs that take place in his chapter, A Season Among the Living, which is an account of his own personal experience tracking wolves by ski in the South Vercors Plateau, 2 hours from Lyon, France. This encounter, like many others, he narrates with wolves, bears, or simply the earthworms of his kitchen compost bin, leads Morizot to develop this theory of interspecies diplomacy, which is informed by conceptual as well as experiential knowledge. This interspecies diplomacy for Morizot rests upon the concept of adjusted consideration. By this term, he means the attempt to do justice to the otherness of non-human forms of life through honing an attuned style of attention. Recognition of relationship involves respecting the radical alterity of other ways of existing. And so in speaking and writing about alien kin, as Morizot does in this section of his book, one never kind of fully achieves a justice to the other ways of being alive, but through the kind of repeated failures, one continues an existential task of translating the customs and ethos of other life forms by bending language so as to let their strangeness appear. Morizot suggests we approach this as if we have just landed on another planet and might seek to embark upon extraterrestrial ethnography to emphasize the different forms of speech, language, and cognition that are neither a lack nor a deficiency. The sheer otherness of these life forms makes them seem alien to the experience of human beings, but adjustment of human behavior is necessary to address the crisis of sensibility that Morizot diagnoses in the contemporary world. He is not content, however, to dwell upon the wonder and awe of this dialogue between human and wolf. Like Leopold before him, Morizot listens to the howl of the wolf with one ear to this moment of awakening and wonder, and with the other ear, he listens to how millions of years of evolution are folded into a song, carefully explaining the behavior of a grouping howl, what happens when a pack of wolves seeks to reunite each night and begin their collective life. For Morizot, the evolutionary shaping of the howl does not exhaust the layered multiplicity of the functions of the wolf's howl, but provide the conditions for novelty, inventiveness, and freedom. So by holding together the kinship between human language and the wolf howl, as well as the radical alterity of the wolf's embodied capacity for sonic invention, one can begin to dwell in this existential, experiential paradox that Morizot describes. And so, as Morizot argues in his book, if we want to change politics, we must transform the attention we pay to the non-human world. And that can take place in terms of eco-sensitive tracking of wolves as he writes about so eloquently, but it can also take place in the attention we show to the vermicompost bin on the kitchen counter, or sea sponge we find in the shower, which also are great examples that Morizot kind of elaborates upon in this work. So in the conclusion to my article, I'd share my own story about when I was struggling to finish the first draft, and I went for a walk on the campus trail and encountered this wonderful barred owl, and kind of sat beneath it for a few minutes listening to this cacophony of bird alarms that was going on all around it, and just kind of waited patiently while a number of people kind of went by me on the trail without noticing that the owl was there. And then I kind of talk about how this wonder or this surprise is vexed or fraught, because barred owls actually have a very ecologically destructive role as they are introduced to this habitat. They may be responsible for decimating western screech owls, which are endangered on Vancouver Island, where I live. And I put this question to my students recently, you know, should we embrace, as they are all up and down the Pacific Northwest, which has been in the news recently, should we embrace the eradication of the barred owls in order to save the local western screech owls? And they were very opposed, but it was a really fascinating discussion in terms of the ethical stakes which are at play here. And yeah, I'm still conflicted. I would not sign on to the letter that's been circulated by animal welfare groups saying that we must save the barred owl. But the wonder and surprise that I feel through my daily encounters with them has definitely been challenged through attending to the voices of the field biologists who are writing about their very destructive and devastating role on local ecosystems. And so I wanted to end just with one field recording composition that kind of narrates in its own way an encounter with a Cooper's hawk close to my house. And these are some photos from the sound walk that I led, this kind of impromptu sound walk after the paper at the ISEE conference. And this kind of gestures towards my future research, which is trying to use field recording and sound walks as a way to investigate and promote urban ecological restoration sites. So yeah, I'll just play this and we'll end.
Okay, so I'm just scrolling. So I think Daphna has a question next. Daphna, do you want to unmute and share your question? Yes.
And I think Julian, this one was posed during Justin and Nora's talk, but I think you could respond as well. So this was a sort of Peter Singer connection from Daphne in the original question. And to paraphrase the question, it's, does greater attention lead to greater moral considerability? Is there a direct connection between the things we pay attention to becoming more valuable? Sort of, and I think the Singer connection there is sort of like the expanding moral circle kind of story, right?
Yeah, I might start briefly and then I'll just hand the floor. So on the one hand, like I think that's true, and the Singer connection is really interesting. I mean, there is maybe some kind of tension there because at least with our focus on attention, and I think even the Julian's Murdochian influence, there is a sense that attention can function to perceive beyond categories and even beyond categorization, such as sentience, which obviously is very important for Peter Singer. So to some extent, there's resonances with Singer, and also maybe tensions, because attention, and this is like rethinking about the great article from Thomas Birch, it could even perhaps we find have a deontic experience in relation to a rock, something that's totally non-sentient, you know. So I think it allows us to keep our options open in terms of the categories of moral inclusion. So that's maybe one thing I'll say about the Singer connection. But in terms of that question about attention and moral considerability, I'll maybe open the floor if Julian or Justin, you want to speak to that.
I'll just quickly add that, like, you know, if one's attending well, it does seem like you're like giving them moral consideration, right? And that's like kind of part of it. Like you're responding to their call. I mean, one of the reasons why we don't kind of run with Singer more is because, in a certain sense, and this is just me speaking, where it's like, you know, Singer's emphasizing this important aspect about their ability to suffer, but it's exactly that. Like, yeah, we want to take that into consideration, but certainly not reduce animals to suffering, because then it just is highlighting this passivity. And with the improvised dance, or like, you know, listening to these beautiful bird songs, there's like this aesthetic dimension, or like this excessive character where they're active, creative participants in the world. And so we've been, that was one of the reasons why we kind of latched onto this playfulness or an improvised dance to like kind of get involved with it.
To jump in on the behalf of Daphne, I could imagine a slight counter there, Justin, right? Because it feels like what you're after is the capacity to be attended to. Because if moral considerability is attached directly to the attending, then we might misattend and miss something's value, right? So it's whether you're after a subjective or an objective account of moral considerability. I think there's a real tension to be worked out there. But yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you. I know we're short on time, and I want to make sure we get through the rest of the queue here. So Marion, course correct us, but I think we've got Arthur, Steve, and then Kate, and then Kim. Is that right?
I think Kim may be ahead of, Kim may be next, and then I think the queue goes as you've described.
Very good. Okay.
Yeah. So I guess I'll just read. Kim says, thank you to all the presenters. Loved hearing your sound mixes, Julian. All this work is valuable if we're really to see the political change. But how do we cut through the busyness of humans to slow down and be attentive and listen more deeply? It's very early in the morning here in Australia. Okay, yeah. So happy to read the question. Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of gives me a good opportunity to talk about some of that. What was going on in that last sound composition, because I like to just let people listen to it. But so that was like just in this ecological restoration site that's like a 10-minute walk from my house. And I was just kind of walking through there one morning and saw this, you know, this crowd of crows. And then I kind of was like, whoa, that's, you know, that there's a lot going on there. They're you know, acting really agitated, and they kind of led me, as well as the Anna's hummingbirds that you heard there, who are kind of mobbing this juvenile Cooper's hawk, and then I got this like really exceptional sound recording of that hawk, and I kind of have been playing with it in different ways, and then all the stuff that comes after that is to try and kind of emphasize the fact that that was like listened to, and I had that whole encounter and experience and kind of surprising moment with the hawk, like right in the middle of the city, right? And then after I kind of walked over to a restaurant and got some lunch, and all the kind of clamorous sounds that come after that are just from like the street and walking over there. And so the way I would answer that is that, you know, we need to find ways of not kind of making attention and kind of deep listening and you know, a kind of separate thing that requires so much time out of our busy lives, but find ways that we can kind of weave it within, right? I mean, I'm always struck by how much time people put into these kind of adventurous backpacking trips to, you know, go days and hours, you know, which is a great, profound kind of spiritual experience. But, you know, there's so much wildness and vitality, which is just kind of woven in to our daily lives. And some of my most surprising and profound and kind of the experiences that have led me to be more attentive and more considerate of the more than human world are many that I think are do not take much time or do not kind of distract me or get in the way of a busy life. Yeah.
Thank you. I think Arthur is next.
Okay, thanks. This was some great presentations. I actually have a question that I think bridges the two talks. So I'm curious about something that Julian said specifically about how this attention, paying attention and listening need not be rival or to maybe a more scientific approach, but rather complementary. And I think that you know, a lot of that might resonate, but I also wonder if there can be tension. And so I want to ask about that. In particular, I'm wondering about some scientists that have recently tried to use bioacoustics to to quantify biodiversity in a landscape. So in particular, one reason why a lot of like technocrats can do something with carbon is they want to quantify it, so you can say there's this area has, you know, a certain amount of drawdown in carbon, so we can put money on that for the carbon budget. The reason why like biodiversity in some of these areas is really hard to like have any kind of policy relevance is because, well, it's hard to measure. So they try to use sound to measure it. So that's both a scientific endeavor and a politically relevant one. I wonder, just for any of the speakers today, what do you think about this relationship? Like, is that consistent with especially like this idea of loving dance and loving attention and this play, this like openness to surprise? Because on the face of it, it could be seen this approach, even though it's using sound and in some sense it's paying attention, it might not be in the right spirit. And could that be one instance where they come apart, where this kind of attention might actually, in a scientific way, might be in tension with a more loving Modokian sort of approach? Thanks.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in first. That's a great question, Arthur. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, part of the kind of future research that I am interested in and involved in is kind of precisely using bioacoustics or bioacoustic methods in terms of you know, field recording and kind of microphones left in the field, and you know, part of it is trying to kind of document biodiversity. But I guess my approach is not kind of quantitative but experiential, and what I think is really important is more of the way in which those techniques, that technology, can be used through things like sound walks, through things like you know, like deep experiential kind of relationships to the land. And yes, I think absolutely there are points of tension. There are ways in which technologies that kind of capture that technologies, that listening, right? Like, I mean, I have in the chapter that's kind of a very expanded version of this, I have, you know, a lot of discussion about how like listening also is not always good, right? Listening is surveillance. Listening is listening in, right? And there are ways there, and I've talked about this with Jonathan too, in terms of the research. There are times when it's very important to not listen, right? To you know, to see kind of one's data that's one's collecting or one's archive as not kind of public or not accessible, but something that is kind of vital or important. But there should be strict kind of guidelines and ethical considerations of when that is not listened to. In terms of how we, you know, how we stop quantifiable biodiversity from being kind of just used as carbon, you know, I think that's beyond my. It's bad. It seems bad, but I don't know how I can kind of intervene in it. Yeah.
Justin, Nora, did you want to add anything on that one?
I was just maybe gonna add that, like, yeah, I do think that there is a tension, and I mean, just from my perspective, it seems like that tension between sensibility and science is one where science has always been given the dominant kind of claim on certain things, and so like part of us, or at least our project, was trying to, you know, balance that out, right? Because like certainly like certain things with like climate change facts and stuff like that, insofar as there are these abstract like facts, they often are failing to move people. And so with us, we do see there being a tension, right? Where there, one, like science might be directing us to these kind of categorical effects about what the other is, and sensibility is associated with these vitality effects. But with our position, we were trying to like kind of, I don't know, dance in that tension, right? Because Malloy was bringing both of those things to inform the ways that she engaged with the bighorns. And so that's what my thoughts are.
I'll try. I don't know. I don't think my internet's very good, but I'll try to also just note. For some reason, the later it goes, the worse it gets in the internet. But I would just say, yeah, I think there obviously there are resonances, and I think it's cool, but also there are perhaps some tensions. And one thing that we think about a lot is like in attending to the natural world or non-humans, like it's we kind of want to problematize like a binary of like observer and observed, and challenge that, because humans have kind of long accepted this role as like the quantifiers or observers of the natural world, as often like a natural world that can't observe back or, you know, is not allowed to observe back. So we're also interested in thinking about forms of attention that in which centers non-human attention. So it's not only a kind of human observation of an environment. And sometimes technology can help that, but of course, sometimes things like binoculars or listening devices can create distance so that the human actually cannot be attended to in return. And I think sometimes that's fine, but also sometimes I think we need to like check ourselves in that as well, and think about forms of attention that we are also the vulnerable ones being seen as well. Thanks.
Okay, and I really actually had two questions, but I'll leave one of them out in the interest of time. Although I do wonder whether we should attend to taxi cabs, but I won't ask that question. It's a question about the idea of reciprocity that seemed to play a role in several of the examples that were given, and especially the one about dance, about dance, because it's not clear to me that there is such reciprocity. That is, it may be that in my interacting with my attending to the things you're talking about, my attending to, I start to change, and I learn things, and my identity changes, and so forth. But it's not clear to me that the owl or whatever it is engaged in that same kind of process with respect to me. It's not learning. Is it learning for me? Is it changing? It can be appropriately thought of as reciprocal in that case, or is there something quite asymmetrical actually about the relationship? Am I being attended to?
Thanks, Stephen. So I think Kate is next. Do you want to unmute Kate, or you want me to read?
Oh, I'm good. I can
Great.
say it real quickly. Hi, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I work in plants, and so I'm really used to these kind of limits between empathy and anthropomorphism. And so I love your offering of talking about play and listening engagement as a way to kind of navigate some of that or make space for the imagination more in our understanding of others. But I can't help but think of anthropomorphism and misunderstanding. And so when that does come up, is there a way that attentiveness and listening can help remedy some of the more negative understandings of anthropomorphism? And this might go into the kind of one-sided response that Nora just gave about technology. Or is that just part of what happens when humans enter into these types of relationships or spaces in this way?
Great. Thank you, Kate. And Kimberly, why don't you ask your question, then we'll do a flurry of responses. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you three for such an excellent set of talks. So I think a lot about reverence and love as environmental virtues, maybe just moral emotions that have the potential to blossom into various environmental virtues. And so I'm wondering, I guess, I have a question about the sort of order of explanation here. So why are we disambiguating or disentangling attention from these other virtues? I suppose the intuition that I have is it might be more useful to think about those particular virtues as being more fundamental than attention, in the sense that, as you've noted, listening, to quote, I think, Julian, is not always good. It can also be surveillance. But if listening is tied to, for example, reverence, love, or I think, as Helen de Cruz argues, wonder, right, then it already has a sort of moral content embedded within it. It's going to be deployed in the right kind of way because it's constrained virtuously or something like that. So just to summarize, why attention? Why not love, reverence, wonder, etc.? And again, thank you. That was really interesting.
Yeah, so let's open it up for some responses from the speakers.
So, Julian, you want to go first? You want me to?
Why don't you go first?
Okay, so real quick, the last question, I loved it, and we're trying even not to disambiguate them, right? Like, and that's why we're like running with like Lagonas and thinking about love as a form of world traveling. And in fact, when we return to Malloy in our last chapter, they're speaking of like devotion too. So like we're trying to capture that like kind of reverence there, and that like attention can kind of open us up to these types of experiences. And then with Stephen's question, it's interesting because I guess I have like opposite intuitions where the one-sidedness is actually going the other way, where non-human animals have constantly had to adapt to human practices, right? And so we're trying to kind of, just like Aristotle and the bent stick, push it the other way. So their asymmetry is intentional because of the history of animals constantly having to adapt to non-human practices and not the other way around. The other thing too, with the question from Kate, yeah, I think that this is important, but like, staying or like with the trouble of misunderstandings, I think is the way to get through them, and like, use them as a way to, or like, as long as one's mindful that we're always misunderstanding something, right? Then that allows us to kind of hopefully get closer to understanding. And like Lagunas too, we were leaning on playfulness in this sense of openness to being a fool, to being wrong. And because like, just to try to maybe help counter that like worry about anthropocentrism or misunderstandings.
Nora, did you want to jump in, or?
You can jump in and.
Okay. Those are really great questions. And I think in my talk, I really kind of am focused a lot on the positive dimensions of listening. I think that is really the heart of what I want to communicate. But that asymmetry, that misunderstanding, is really there in the work for me too. And so many people send me these articles about like how birds make us happy, right? And I'm just kind of like really annoyed it often, but you know, there's these examples of like they play birdsong at gas stations in the UK to like calm people down and stuff, right? So there's definitely a way in which this kind of pleasing nature of soundscapes just like feeds the industrial capitalist machine, right? But I think at the same time, why attention versus love versus, you know, attention seems to be the beginning or the start, right? It's like without really trying to understand how we can kind of move into an attentive kind of attitude or orientation to the world, we can't even begin to see when something is reciprocal or when it is asymmetrical, when, you know, when we are recognized, right? Like you know, I'm not so much in the habit now, but I used to go to this one place by a little creek and sit there, you know, pretty much every day for about half an hour, just really trying to learn the communication, the language of the birds who live there. And those birds recognize me. I don't know if my presence, you know, was good for them or truly reciprocal in a really kind of robust sense, but there was at least recognition, and you can recognize you know, those non-human others recognizing you if you put intention and attention into that for long enough in the same place. And so yeah, so I guess yeah, I think that attention is more open and can also bring us into, you know, like Justin was saying, which is such an important point and something I feel like I do need to kind of integrate into my work more is you know, attention really makes us more aware, more kind of open to the kind of wounds that we are that we experience through the great kind of catastrophe or crisis that's unfolding with our environment. And in a lot of ways, this work of listening more carefully, more deeply, right, it makes one more painfully aware of those absences too, and that's always kind of there in the background for me, but I guess it's not something I've emphasized as much in this work.
Julian and Justin and Nora, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. And again, I'm really grateful to both IEP and ISEE for their co-sponsorship of this event. You all, this conversation has been great. There's a lot more to say. The recording has been captured. So we will, Mary and I will share that with the community as quickly as we can. But again, thank you. Let's give one more round of applause, virtual or otherwise, to our three panelists, Nora and Justin and Julian. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thanks for the great set of questions and the discussion as well. So really appreciate your being here and hope to see you at future similar events. So take care all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.